Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. Today, I'm incredibly fortunate to be joined on the podcast by my friend Honoka, also known as Sneakysmol on Instagram. Honoka was born and raised in Japan, but everyone assumes she is American due to her accent and native English level. We talked about how she was raised bilingual despite never living overseas, and Honoka gave some really useful advice on how to help children learn English naturally. Honoka also runs a popular and bilingual Instagram page focused on Japanese feminism. So, we also discussed Japan's recent performance in the gender inequality rankings and tried to explain why Japan is so unequal. You can find the full transcript of today's episode over on the Thinking in English blog. On the blog as well, there'll be a full vocabulary list for you to check out while you're listening. Head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more content. And if you're interested, please subscribe to my Patreon page, where you can find the full, unedited interview with Honoka. There's about a bonus 15 minutes over on the Patreon page. But that's enough of me talking. Here is today's episode. Hi, Honoka. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Can you introduce yourself to my audience?
Hi, everyone. My name is Honoka. I am from Yokohama, Japan, born and raised. I really love my city. I've never really left my city, but I'm a grad student at Tokyo and I work part-time for a few jobs. And I have a feminist blog on Instagram where I post about feminist issues, especially in Japan.
It's kind of a funny story. I found you through your blog, but I actually know you in real life.
Yeah, such a coincidence.
One of the previous guests on this podcast, Marie from the Feminist Majo blog, she shared something that you had posted. And I thought, wow, this person's written bilingual in Japanese and the English is really good. So maybe I can interview her on my podcast. And then I found out it was someone I've had lots of classes with at graduate school.
Yeah, absolutely. I was very surprised when I got your email. I was like, what a small world.
So you said you're from Yokohama, Japan, but probably my listeners are wondering, are you not American? Because I thought you were American.
Well, I get that a lot. Actually, this month I met like 20 people and all of them came up to me and asked where I'm from in the States. I am not American. I was born and raised in Yokohama, Japan, but I get mistaken for one a lot.
Are you a native English speaker?
No, my mother tongue is Japanese. I grew up in Japan, so I speak mostly Japanese outside of school.
How long have you been studying English then? Because your English, the reason people think you're American, I think is because your accent is very American, but also you use English very naturally. So how long have you been studying or learning, I guess?
Well, as long as I can remember, my mom really wanted me to be bilingual,
Right.
which I'm very thankful for. But since I was born, she basically made me sit in front of a TV watching American shows.
What shows? Do you remember any?
I watched a lot of Disney when I was a kid. So my mom really wanted to immerse me in like English as a baby and when I was a toddler. So I did that. So I never really like fully studied it in the conventional sense, but I learned it through watching TV, just listening to things.
Is your mother like a fluent English speaker?
She speaks it on a business level, so she can work in English. So she has a lot of business meetings and whatnot in English, but she's a very like I learned it in Japan kind of English speaker. So she often asks me for help for things, and she doesn't really understand like memes and like all of the Instagram posts. And
I don't understand memes and Instagram posts, don't worry.
All of that, but she can speak it at a business level, yeah.
So you are now studying in English mainly, right? Your
Yes.
graduate school is mainly in English.
Mhm.
Is it difficult for you to study in English? Or did you do your undergraduate in English as well?
Yes, I did my undergrad in English too. It was a Japanese school, but I did in English. So I've never fully had like a college level education in Japanese, which I know
Ah,
is kind of ridiculous. So I actually had a class this last semester that I had to write in Japanese, and I didn't know how to format it.
right. That was going to be my next question. Are you better at writing in English or in Japanese? Like academically,
Definitely in
formally
English.
in English?
Yes.
Awesome.
I can write in Japanese. It's just that there's a lot of, because of the things I study, there's just not enough lingo and vernacular that I can use in Japanese that apply. So it's easier to just write in English and then think about it in Japanese.
Do you think in English or dream in English, or do you think in Japanese and dream in Japanese?
I do both. It depends on the situation. Like I said, when I'm thinking about feminist issues and whatever, there's just not enough Japanese words to describe the things that I'm thinking because the concept itself doesn't exist sometimes. So then
Yes.
it's easier to think about things in English. But for concepts that only exist in Japanese, obviously that's much easier to think in Japanese. Or when I'm talking to my mom and I'm thinking about her or whatever, it's much easier to think in Japanese. So it depends.
Yeah, I'd assume with feminism, probably Japanese borrows a lot of words from English anyway. So when
Yes.
Japanese feminists talk in Japanese, they're probably using a lot of English origin words, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of loan words. So I have to say English words in a Japanese way and hope that people understand. If not, I'll try to explain it. But yeah, it's kind of hard to just think in Japanese itself for things like that.
Do you still study English now, or is it not something you think about?
I don't really study English, but whenever I like watch the news or like I read something and I don't know a word, I try to look it up and try to incorporate it into my vocabulary list. But I don't actively study English anymore.
How many people would you say mistake you for American a year?
A year. Oh, I don't know. Every time I meet someone new who's an English speaker and I approach them in English first, they ask me, "Oh, which part of the US are you from?" I'm like, "Actually, I'm not."
Have you been
So,
to the US?
yes, I go to the US actually quite often because my partner lives in the US.
Have you studied in the US?
I've never studied in the US. The longest time I've stayed in the US is probably 2.5 weeks.
Okay, right. So how does it make you feel when someone assumes you're American?
I try to take it as a compliment to my English and my pronunciation, but sometimes I can tell that it's not really a compliment when it's certain people, but I always try to say, "Oh, thank you." Like I'm gonna take it as a compliment and just laugh it off.
It's not just language when people, I guess, assume you're American, because I think culturally, you use a lot of like slang that would be common in America. And I think would it be fair to say the way you dress, the way you act is not completely Japanese, right?
Absolutely. Actually, this happened about 2 weeks ago. A boy who I'd never met came up to me and asked me from which part of the US I was from. And I said, "I'm from here." And he said, "Oh, I assumed you were from the US because of the way you look." And I was like, "Oh, that actually, I get that a lot too because I don't wear the conventional Japanese makeup or I don't have bangs, which is very common in Japanese girls. I'm not trying to look particularly non-Japanese. It's just the way I like to dress. But I'm definitely influenced by a lot of like American looks and aesthetics because of the way I grew up and just watching a lot of the TV shows. So
Right.
naturally, I just like things like that more, I guess.
Like I said, I found you through your blog on Instagram. You make really informative and interesting bilingual posts about feminism and especially feminism in Japan. Can you tell us a little bit about your blog?
Well, it's an Instagram blog where I mostly discuss Japanese feminist issues, but also certain global topics that are basically trending that week. Some topics are things that really don't seem like a huge deal, like, for example, maybe what kind of drinks you order and choose at a bar. But those kind of things also have a lot to do with stereotypes and cultural backgrounds. So little mundane things like that, as well as, like I said, big topics like this month we had the US abortion laws. So I talked a little bit about that. So I just talk about overall issues surrounding feminism that I can find or I thought of in the spot.
I don't think we've mentioned the name of your blog.
Oh,
What's the
yeah.
name?
So the name of my blog is you can find me at Sneakysmol. That's sneaky like SNEAKY and small written SMOL, not in the traditional big small kind of way.
So you've been running the blog for about 2 years, I guess. Most people would start something in the pandemic 2 years ago, and then they would have quit. So why did you continue? Why are you still doing it now, 2 years later?
Well, when I originally started, like I didn't really intend like for it to be such a big deal. I mean, it's not a big deal, but for me, it has significance now. And while I was posting things, a lot of people would DM me or comment saying they were looking for a place like this where they can discuss and also let out their frustrations like me. And I realized, oh, like there are other people like me who are looking for a place and who need this space, the safe space to discuss things that they kept inside. And I just really wanted to give people a chance to be able to have that safe space. With the pandemic, it became even more difficult to find a place because we can't go out. And the only place that we could all kind of get together was online. So I figured I should just continue this so that people have a place to get together and let out whatever it is that they're holding inside.
Is it a challenge to make bilingual posts?
Absolutely. It's really hard to convey what I want to say in Japanese because the concept itself sometimes just does not exist. I usually have to think about them in English and then kind of convert it into Japanese. I sometimes do the opposite because a lot of the issues that I talk about is Japanese. A lot of feminist lingo just doesn't exist. So I try to think of like the harder academic words in English and then translate that into Japanese and see if they actually make sense and if they're saying the same thing. And sometimes that's just really difficult and time consuming, but I really want people who aren't English speakers, who can't understand English, who don't understand English or is learning English to be able to also have that space and understand and learn. So I try to make it bilingual as much as I can and make it very similar.
I know some of my followers already follow your account because when I looked, some of the people that I follow also follow you. There'll be quite a few Japanese people listening to this podcast now. So if you're interested in feminism, please go over to Sneakysmol because it's a great place to practice English as well as learn something important. But one of your recent posts, which I found really interesting, was about the gender gap in Japan. Some of my listeners might be surprised to hear how Japan performed in the global gender gap or global gender equality rankings. How did Japan do?
So Japan was sadly 116th out of 146 countries this year. There are usually more countries ranked. In comparison, there's not a lot of countries that were reported this year, but we performed quite poorly. A lot of people outside of the country have told me that that's really shocking to them, because when you hear about Japan, you think, oh, it's such a advanced country. You have a lot of technology. You have so many different pop cultures and different cultures. So they're very shocked to hear, oh, they're 116th out of 146. That seems really low. But the lived reality of people who don't identify as male in this country is not exactly equal. And I feel that all the time, which is why I post about it, rant about it a lot.
All across the world, there are problems with gender equality, of course. But people often, I guess, put Japan in with kind of Western Europe or North America or like Australia and New Zealand. They assume that Japan is, and probably Korea as well, they put Japan and Korea with these other countries, whereas in reality, Japan and Korea are two of the worst performing countries in the entire world for gender equality. When we say gender equality, what are the different categories of equality?
The rankings rank gender equality in 4 aspects. One is education, the second one is politics, third is economics, and the last one is health.
Okay.
And Japan performs quite well when it comes to education because we have achieved gender parity.
Yeah, it's number one in the world, right?
Yes, exactly.
Which makes the low score so surprising. How can
Exactly.
you be number one in a quarter of the ranking, but 116th in everything else?
Well, we perform very poorly on the other aspects, sadly. It's great that we achieve gender parity, but even within the not for education, I mean, even within education, there's still a lot of inequality with the kind of things that we can study. Girls are still not encouraged to go into STEM, which is a huge problem. And sometimes schools even discourage it. So they don't allow girls to enter certain universities, even though they perform better than boys. So there's like a system that makes us not be able to pursue certain aspects of education.
I guess the problems in Japanese education in terms of equality are not Japan specific, right? It's kind of the whole world faces these problems, but it's in the other categories where Japan performs poorly, often due to things in Japan. For example, health. The Japanese healthcare system is pretty good. So why is there health inequality in Japan, and how did they perform in the ranking?
In the rankings, they didn't perform as poorly as the politics and economics aspect of it, but it still wasn't number one like education. One of the big issues when it comes to health is that we don't really support women when it comes to reproductive health, because Japan has a very low birth rate, and politicians are always encouraging women to have more babies, but we don't have enough support for that, even when it comes to health. So we're always told that whenever we feel sick, it's kind of just like, get over it. You know, you're not actually sick. We're having problems because we're on our period. It doesn't matter. Go to work. And we're never fully supported in those areas. And we're also never believed when we say we're sick. People just brush it off and say, you know, it's okay. You're tough enough. Just go to work. I feel like it's really important for health sectors to realize that women also have bodies that have medical needs, and to believe us and to cater to us, not just have medicine be for everyone, because it's not a all fits all.
So Japan was about 60th in the world, right, for
Yeah.
health. So not performing well, kind of behind the standards of Western European countries and Canada and Australia, but not the worst. But then the next two categories get significantly lower rankings, politics and economics, right? Let's start with economics. What is the problem with economic equality in Japan?
Well, as for why we perform so badly in the current ranking is that the pandemic really made a difference for the workforce in Japan, especially for women. Most women in Japan work as what's the word?
Temporary or irregular workers.
Exactly. Irregular workers. Exactly. That's the word I was looking for. And they were usually more likely to be working in the service industry. So they were cashiers or people working as waiters in a restaurant. So when the pandemic hit, they didn't have chances to go to work anymore because their work was shut down. So then people were laid off and they were more likely to be told to go home in comparison to men. So their economic participation was really low compared to men. And even if women were able to go to work, they were always encouraged to stay home with their kids because kids weren't going to school. So who's going to stay home with them and take care of them? Usually that were women. Then again, their economic participation went down and overall the rankings went down.
You've grown up in Japan and I've spent quite a lot of time studying Japanese working. But most of my listeners probably don't know much about Japanese, I guess, employment or the work system. So something not completely unique to Japan, but it's still present in Japan today, is a lifelong employment system. You start work when you're 21, 22, and you work for the same company until you retire. But the problem for women is if they leave work to have children and raise their children, they can't enter this system again. So all of the good, well-paid, well, it's Japan, so not that well-paid, but the good, well-paid jobs, they lose them once they, generally by the time most women are 35, they've had a child and then they can't enter the workforce again. They're reliant on temporary jobs. So that's what Honoka was talking about, is these women with temporary jobs or irregular jobs, working, minimum wage, they're the ones who were unable to continue working during COVID, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, because in Japan, once you're 22, you get your job and you're expected to stay at that job forever. So often they would ask women like, are you sure you're going to be able to stay at this work? Because obviously they want more workers, but they don't want workers who would just up and quit. But they don't have a system where women can come back when they want to come back, to go back into the work they love and want to do. And then the government still tells us that we need to have more babies.
Why is Japan politically unequal?
Well, my opinion, this is just my opinion, is that I think the people in power, who are mostly older men, don't want change because they don't want to change a system that benefits them. So why would they let in people who would create change and make it harder for them, to, so to speak? And although in the election this month, there was a record 35 seats won by women, which is incredible. It's a great thing for women to have a seat at the table, and I'm really glad that they won their seats. But even when female politicians are in government, they're usually very influenced by the patriarchy, or they're heavily influenced by the patriarchy. So they aren't really an accurate representation of what female citizens need. And they rarely are able to speak up about the kind of issues that we need them to speak up about. It makes it harder for us to have a voice in the government and politics.
I think it's quite easy to assume that if a woman is elected to parliament or to the national diet in Japan or Congress in America, that's some achievement for feminism. And that's the wrong way to think about it. I always give the example of my country, the UK. We've had two female leaders, Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May, both kind of really anti-feminists, right? They're conservative politicians. And we might have another female leader in September. We're still deciding, but it's either going to be Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak. And Liz Truss is also a conservative, not a particularly liberal person looking to change and make the country more equal and fairer. Just because women are in parliament doesn't mean they're actually going to be voting as a feminist, voting as a liberal, progressive woman.
Exactly. So, I am very happy that a lot of seats were won by women. That's incredible. It's great because we do need seats. But just because we filled the quota doesn't mean that we are going to have a voice. And what's important is for us to be heard, not for us to have a seat.
So we've talked about Japanese sort of gender inequality across these four different categories: health, politics, economics, and education. Do you think there is a reason overall why Japan is considered quite an unequal country in this regard? Is there an overarching reason?
Well, I think it's because we've settled in what's comfortable, and no one has questioned why we're just comfortable in this situation. Because I hear a lot of people, even my age, I talk to them about things that I'm concerned about when it comes to Japanese feminism, and they're like, why are you concerned about that? Who cares? We're comfortable, we live a life, we're not dying, it's fine. But for me, who wants to have more for women, who wants women to have more opportunity, not just women, who want people who are not cisgendered heterosexual men to have more opportunities, it's kind of like, why have we settled in what we have right now? And whenever I think about that, I feel like it's because people who are not cisgendered heterosexual men haven't really had an opportunity, or were allowed to ask why we're in this patriarchal society. And it's because the people who are uncomfortable with the situation, like I am, rarely have a voice or have a chance to question things. And the powerful people, who are usually elderly men, would obviously not want to relinquish their power to give us a little bit more say. So the people in charge would never make such changes. And then the people who are not in charge are settled. So we don't actually make change.
How do you think the situation can be improved? How do you think Japan can become a more equal country in regards to gender?
I really think that educating young people is really important. Trying to influence young minds into realizing that their limitations aren't within their gender is really important, because it's really hard to change the minds of people who are already settled into what they believe in. Making sure that the new generation knows that their limits are whatever they decide it is important. So I want younger people, whether it's people in their 20s or younger, or like I said, like toddlers and babies, to be able to move on from this patriarchal society and understand. And that's why I want to post things that are more relatable to people who are younger, so that they can slowly start to realize new things and new possibilities and new kind of ideas that weren't really common to them growing up.
Kind of moving on towards the end of the podcast, do you have any tips or advice or recommendations for learning English or learning about feminism for my listeners?
Well, as for English, the best way that I learned was basically just watching a lot of TV. I love TV. I know that TV influences a lot because of the way I am. I completely adopted my accent from TV. I didn't live in the US. I didn't have any English teachers that taught me specifically like American English. It was just completely TV. So like, if you enjoy something, maybe try watching it in English. Have subtitles, that's completely fine, but maybe just try to adapt your ear to it. As for reading and writing, when I was younger, I used to write a lot of like short stories. They weren't for anyone to read. They weren't very grammatically correct. The structure was all over the place, but I just really liked writing. If you have a chance, maybe just jot some ideas down or write a short story or write a diary or something.
Yeah, writing a diary is a good tip. And actually, reading is the best way to improve your writing.
Because and I loved reading.
Yeah,
my bookshelf was stocked when I was younger. My mom had a lot of trouble finding English books for me because this was before Amazon. It's definitely great to read. I love reading, so that's a great tip for English. As for feminism and learning about that, I would say especially for Japanese people, try to look at things with like a critical eye. If it's TV, like I've been saying all the time, I have a lot of trouble watching Japanese TV now because I have the perspective of feminism. So I'm very critical about the types of people portrayed on TV or the kind of things they're saying.
Most of my listeners are between the ages of 28 and 40. Like my biggest, I have listeners from all ages, but 28 and 40 is about 50% of my audience. And that is kind of the age where people have children. Maybe some of them are making an effort to educate their children in English from an early age. So as a child who was educated in English from when you were born, basically, do you have any advice for raising a bilingual child as a bilingual child? What was good for you? Is there anything that your mum did well and anything that you think you didn't enjoy when you were young?
So what I think my mom did really well is that I never questioned my environment, which I know is really difficult living in Japan. So like I said in the beginning, I really didn't know Mickey Mouse spoke Japanese. So it was just natural to me. So whenever I would watch TV, this was back 20 years ago, she would ask people who are living in the US to send VHS tapes with the commercials and everything to us, and we would send them a Japanese one, so we would exchange. So whenever I would watch it, there were commercials, like American commercials and everything, so it was never weird to me. So I hear a lot of people saying their kids telling them to like change the channel or change the language settings, but I didn't know that was an option. So it's good to make it as comfortable and as like natural as possible, I guess. I know that's very, very difficult to do, but make sure that your kids, I know this is like a really weird thing to say, but just like to make sure that they're not questioning why they're doing it. It's just part of their life. My mom was always judged when I was younger because 20 years ago it was not as common as it is now to try and raise your kids bilingual. So people would tell her Honoka's Japanese is going to be really bad because you're doing that. And she told herself that can't be true. Like, she lives in Japan, she will be fine. She continued doing what she was doing, and I turned out like this, and I'm quite proud of my English. So to all the people listening who want to learn English, consistency, I think, really is key.
Yeah, and I think you're a great role model, not just to people learning English, because you kind of learned it as a native speaker, but also to people wanting to raise a child who is bilingual. Honoka is an example that you can raise a fluent child in 2 languages. But we've kind of got to the end of the episode. So just finally, please plug yourself. Tell people where they can find you and what kinds of things you're doing at the moment.
Well, please find me at Sneakysmol. That's SNEAKYSMOL on Instagram. I also work for a social business called She Stands. That's SHE, stands STANDS. Where I also post about Japanese feminism and issues. We're a social business that tries to get women who kind of quit their jobs because of childcare or who weren't able to pursue their careers because of differing reasons. And we try to support them by getting them back into the workforce, or we have consulting for different types of companies so that they can promote more DEI things. So that's also a great place to follow, but please also follow my actual account where I post about Japanese feminism and just little things that I notice throughout just living in Japan. If you want to DM, comment, that's incredibly supportive for me, and I always read all of them, so please do.
Yeah, definitely go and have a look at all of Honoka's posts, and they're all in English and in Japanese as well. So perfect for everyone listening. Thank you so much, Honoka.
No, thank you so much.
Here is today's final thought. So that was my conversation with Honoka. I hope you all enjoyed listening. We talked about a lot of different things. Being raised bilingual, writing a blog on feminism, inequality in Japan, and some tips on how to help you learn English. If any of you are interested in raising children to become bilingual English speakers, I think Honoka is a great role model. She is Japanese, educated and lived in Japan her whole life, but speaks English fluently due to immersion as a child. And I really recommend checking out her Instagram page. She makes some really informative and easy to understand posts on women's issues in Japan and around the world. Would you consider your country equal? Would you try to raise your child bilingual? Do you enjoy writing and watching TV in English? Let me know in the comments on the blog, the comments on Spotify, or reach out to me on Instagram. I always love hearing from every single person. Make sure you check out Honoka's Instagram as well, at Sneakysmol. All of the links are in the description of the podcast, and you can find them on the blog or check out my Instagram page. I'll do a post with Honoka on Instagram. If you love listening to Thinking in English and you want to help me and help support the podcast and help us keep going, please consider signing up to my Patreon page. Over on Patreon, you can find bonus episodes. You can find the full unedited episode of this podcast. I recorded with Honoka for maybe about 45 to 50 minutes, but I only released 28 or 29 minutes of that conversation. So there's an extra bonus 15 minutes where we talked about Mickey Mouse and lots of other interesting details you might be interested in, I guess. You can also join the Discord, a group messaging platform where I'm really happy to see people from different countries talking in English already. And we're going to organize discussion classes over there really soon. And you can have one-on-one English classes with me if you join the top tier on the Patreon. So I'd really encourage you all to join. It'd be an amazing thing. But if not, follow me on Instagram, share with a friend. That's absolutely enough as well. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope you have a good week.